Welcome to the Joe Thomas podcast. That was my really bad American accent. Obviously, I'm not actually an American, but my name is Joe Thomas. This is my podcast. I'm an Australian who basically is on Substack, and on Substack, I write articles about American politics, media, and culture, and also do Substack live videos on there. So you can find me under the Joe Thomas newsletter on Substack. If you're listening to this on a different platform like Spotify or Apple iTunes. So basically today, I thought I would talk about a few different things. First of all, being an Australian who talks a lot about American politics, one of the things I thought I'd talk about today is actually something that is connected between both American politics and an Australian. Well, maybe not politics, maybe politics to some degree, but also media. I want to talk about Rupert Murdoch. Now, a lot of people know Rupert Murdoch as the owner of Fox News, the New York Post, and a few. And what else does he own? Wall Street Journal. So he owns quite a. Is quite influential in America, especially with Fox News. I've got to say that a lot of times when I write articles on my Substack, I will write, obviously because I'm consider myself a liberal in American terms. Like basically, I'd be a Democrat if I was in America, and I criticize Trump a lot. So a lot of times I will say, well, I can't believe that Americans basically elected him twice. It was one thing to do it once, but twice. I often know a lot of reasons, and I understand why, but I always make sure that I differentiate between in America about people who voted for Trump and people who didn't vote for Trump or voted for Kamala Harris. So I think those are very two different people. I feel really bad for the non-MAGA people in America, and I do write about that. I think sometimes they get a lot of criticism from people in other countries, other Western countries like Australia or the UK or Europe, and they sort of lump everyone in together. I think in a way I feel more sorry for them than I do for my country, because at least as an Australian, when I look at what Donald Trump is doing, I can, at least it's separation. I'm not living in America, I'm living in Australia. So in a way, the non-MAGA Americans are in a worse situation than the rest of us. So we should feel more sympathy for those people. Even though, sometimes people say, well, why, you're an Australian, mind your own business. Generally, I'll get that from MAGA. And my answer to that is, well, Trump is the president of the United States, the most powerful country on the planet, and the strongest economic country on the planet, militarily the strongest country. So what America does has a massive influence on the rest of the world, and especially when that president is putting tariffs on the rest of the world, including Australia. So I think I have a pretty good reason to be able to criticize Trump, because Trump affects a lot of things that happens around the world. A lot of people will say, I've heard before, including myself, I've noticed that a lot of Americans are quite insular in terms of how they look at the world. Like they have less interest in what's happening in other countries. They do themselves. Well, I guess that's natural, but I guess they don't have almost any interest about what's happening in other countries. They're probably a little bit more naive. But I think there's a good reason for that. And I think the reason for that is, if you're an American, you're living in a country. It's like the most powerful country on the planet, economically, but also culturally. Most films come from America. Most of the streaming services on TV come from America. So it's perfectly understandable why someone in America would feel less inclined to look at a smaller country like Australia, unless it's like Steve Irwin or or Crocodile Dundee, something like that, because you are the biggest country. So it's much more understandable for a smaller country to look up to the United States than the other way around. So I totally get that. But I think where Americans miss out on when they do that is they're missing trends that are happening around the world, right? So in 2024, there was a lot of trends happening before the election in the United States. One of the biggest trends in 2024 was that so many incumbent governments in all these Western countries, right, were being kicked out. right, all around the world, and they were being kicked out because of post-COVID inflation, right? So that's the number one reason countries were getting kicked out, and political parties were getting kicked out, and that's very, so when I saw what was going on, and now America's election was towards the end of the year, so we already saw all these other countries go through similar things and it didn't really matter whether the political party was center left or center right or whatever. They got whoever the incumbent government was, they got blamed for post-COVID inflation. So the truth is that Kamala Harris was always in a difficult position because of that. And obviously, we do know that most of the polling showed that that the main reason why people voted for Trump was because of the economy, cost of living, all that sort of stuff. So, and also Trump was willing to lie a lot more than anyone else. He basically come out with like, we'll bring inflation down after 24 hours. We'll end the wars in 24 hours. We'll do this. Everything was 24 hours. Bam, bam, bam. And on the other side, you had Kamala Harris and the Democrats more focused on Trump being an authoritarian. They did have some other economic policies, but that kind of got drowned away. And I think at the end of the day, people voted on economics more than they did whether they thought Trump was an authoritarian. So, I believe that Trump is an authoritarian, but unfortunately, you see that around the world over and over again, is that people are more likely to vote on cost of living than on that sort of stuff. Also in America in 2024, a lot less people were paying attention to politics every day. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is post-COVID, where a lot of people during COVID were staying at home. They got connected to TikTok and streaming services, and so they stopped watching the news or participating in the news. And all the polling also showed that people who were less informed voted for Trump, and people who were more informed voted for Kamala Harris. And that certainly shows in the kind of people he got. He got a lot of people who weren't paying attention to politics, right? So last year, when you saw Trump showing up in court every day for the indictments and the documents case and all that stuff, people just weren't paying attention to that. In fact, they might have even believed that it was a witch hunt, all that sort of stuff, because he was out there saying it. And I think he was getting away with it because, people weren't paying a lot of attention to it. So, I think you have the MAGA base, which is probably about 30%. And then there's a whole bunch of other people who didn't vote for him because they're part of the MAGA base, but purely on economics. Zoran Mandami in New York, one of the reasons he got quite well known is because he was doing TikTok videos where he was going into areas of New York who voted overwhelmingly for Trump. And he asked them on his TikTok video, why did you vote for Trump? And a lot of them said, look, I wasn't a big fan of Trump, but economics. So they just believe Trump's lies, And for us centre-left people, we know it's a lie. We know he didn't really mean that. But for a lot of people who aren't following politics, they did. I think in Australia, when I was looking at that, I was thinking, how are people buying into these lies? But again, if you're not following politics, it's an easier thing to do. So going back to Rupert Murdoch and his connection to both Australia and America, of course, Rupert Murdoch, if you hear him talk, he sounds like me, well, a little bit like me. He's got an Australian accent because he is an Aussie. And he went to America, I think it was in the 90s, around the 80s or 90s, and he became an American citizen, right? And for those of you who watch the TV show Succession, which is one of my favourite shows, partly modelled on the Murdochs, the family, the Rupert Murdochs. There's been a whole thing in the media for the last couple of years. There's been a court case in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the court case has been about succession of who's going to get the money, right, and who's going to get access to Fox News, News Corp, all those organisations. Now, a couple of years ago, Murdoch put it in. So basically, you have Rupert Murdoch, who's obviously the patriarch, the leader of the family, who owns all this stuff. But then you have basically 4 children. You've got 2 daughters and 2 sons. Lachlan Murdoch is the heir apparent. In a sense, he's the one that Rupert Murdoch wants to take over Fox News. And then you have James and 2 sisters as well. And the difference, the reason why, and they all had one point towards voting power for the estate when Rupert Murdoch died. Now, the problem there was, of course, is that Lachlan Murdoch, one of Rupert Murdoch's sons, he is is the only conservative. The rest of the siblings are more sort of liberals or centrists or that sort of thing. I wouldn't call them ultra left, but they're like liberals, right? Probably centre left centrist, and they're not big fans of Fox News. They're not big fans of Donald Trump, and so had they got power, and they would have been able to outvote Lachlan Murdoch. And Lachlan Murdoch is like his father; he's more conservative, right? So Rupert Murdoch basically wanted to give it to his son Lachlan because he knew Lachlan was the only one of his children, right, who would have kept Fox News conservative, kept the New York Post conservative, and kept a bunch of other ones. Like for example, in Australia, Rupert Murdoch owns Sky News, which is like which is also in the UK. It's a cable TV network, which is also conservative. He also owns 80% of our newspapers here. Again, also very conservative. So he's done the same thing in Australia. He doesn't have as much power in Australia because most of what he owns is newspapers, and people don't read the newspapers. And Sky News, the cable, almost nobody watches. So he doesn't have the power here than he used to. But he used to have a lot of power when people read newspapers. And in fact, both leaders during election campaigns, whether they're centre left or centre right, would generally go and have a meeting with him to try to get him on their side. But obviously, he's a conservative, so that. But anyway, they don't do that anymore because he doesn't have the same power. Because who reads papers anymore? But Fox News still has a lot of sway within the conservative movement. Even though most of the people who watch Fox News are generally above the age of 65, 75, a lot of people do watch Fox on different platforms besides cable. They will watch, they'll have clips of Fox News and they'll put them on YouTube or TikTok. And so they're actually getting more circulation amongst younger people than we realize because of the way they're put onto different platforms. So, so basically this new court case now has basically allowed. So initially with the initial court case, Rupert Murdoch wanted his son Lachlan to take over power of News Corp, Fox News, and everything because he was the only one he trusted, right, to keep it conservative. But he also didn't want to give the other siblings money, like heaps of money for it. He just wanted to do it, right? I mean, they've already got a lot of money, but we're talking about what happens when he passes away. So in this particular court case, where they've now, or in this particular, where they've come to an agreement, the whole family's come to an agreement, which has happened a couple of days ago, is basically Lachlan will get everything that his dad wanted, but the kids did get, the other kids, the more liberal kids, the three of them, the James and two sisters, they did get money, right? So they initially weren't going to get anything besides what they already have, but they got around $1 billion each during this, once he passes away. So obviously that's a pretty big thing. But I will have to say that a lot of the children, especially James Murdoch, made a lot of it about political, about Fox News being too conservative and too, all this sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, they kind of folded for money, and a lot of money. So so again, at the end of the day, they did talk the big talk, the other kids, the siblings, about stopping Fox News and all that sort of stuff. And they also believe in climate change, and they don't like the way that that Trump and Fox News talk about climate change. So that, in that sense, they were more liberal. But at the end of the day, as I said, they basically rolled over and took the money and then gave basically Lachlan all the power when his dad passes away. So, that's a lot of that stuff as well. So the other thing I want to talk about today is the killing people on the boats. So the Pete Hegseth, the man who hates DEI, but probably because he's so bad at his job and he's so, basically, remember the leak, when that leak information about the attack on the Houthis, and that they sent that information to the journalist by accident. So he's really incompetent. And obviously he's always talking about how much he hates DEI. But I've got to say, if he's probably the best thing that's ever happened to DEI in a way, because him always saying that we're getting rid of DEI and, replacing him with the best and the brightest, and then basically, ends up being a complete clown, has probably done more to encourage people to go back to DEI than anybody else. Because if this is the best and the brightest, then I think we need DEI back ASAP. So basically, the Trump administration bombed with a drone a boat that was coming from Venezuela, and it was still near. It was in international waters, but near Venezuela, and they basically blew it up with 11 people on there. Now they're saying that these people on the board were about drug smugglers and are about to enter the United States. Now, a couple of things with that. It is actually illegal to just kill people, even if they are drug smugglers, right? You can't actually, there is no, even under terrorism law in the United States, which there was, I think in 2001, they brought in a terrorism law where you're allowed to do certain things, right? That had to do with Al Qaeda, right, and Islamic groups. Not to do, it wasn't to do with this because it was that was based on the fact that it might be an immediate threat to the United States, right? 11 people coming over, whether drug smugglers or not, is not an immediate threat to the United States. There's already plenty of drugs in the United States. So you can't just kill people because you think they're drug smugglers, right? That's illegal, right? Secondly, they provided no proof that they were drug smugglers, right? So as far and they're not going to provide proof. So again, we're supposed to take the word of an incompetent government, right, who's made so many mistakes. They sent people to El Salvador, right, incorrectly, and they admitted they made mistakes with El Salvador. So if they're sending people to El Salvador prisons, right, and they admit they made mistakes, right, and now they're telling us that they bombed a ship, a small boat with 11 people on there, and trust us, those people were all drug smugglers, bad people. I don't think that they have enough credibility. It's also important that New York Times a couple of weeks ago, or last week, brought out a story about something that happened in Trump's first term in 2017, where he okayed a US Navy SEAL to go in, and what they want into North Korea, they wanted to basically put some basically wiretaps in there and listen, so they could listen to what was going on. And it wasn't very successful, but in the process of doing that, they killed, they blew up a boat, killing like civilian North Korean, they were fishermen, right? So again, here we have a Trump government who killed innocent North Koreans doing fishing by accident in the last term. And this time, they've sent people off to El Salvador, who they admit they made mistakes. And now we're supposed to take these people at their word that these people, the 11 people on that boat, were all drug traffickers. Now, again, it doesn't matter even if they were, it's still a crime. They could have intercepted the boat under the international rules. The United States could have intercepted that boat in international waters, but they didn't do that. They had other ways to stop those people from getting to the United States. They didn't have to blow up the boat, right? And so again, it's all these things that that don't make any sense. And the other thing a lot of people have said, and these are people who are experts in this sort of area, it's very unusual for a boat which is carrying drugs to have 11 people on board, because they generally want to have as much room for the drugs as possible. And they would generally have 2 or 3 people on there, not 11 people. 11 people on a boat that size is highly unlikely, right? On the other hand, what some people suggest, and again, nobody knows for sure who those people on the boat were, but another possibility could have been people smugglers. So they were people smugglers bringing people over to the United States, right? So again, we don't know for sure because the Trump administration won't release the details. But the idea that you can just blow up a boat with 11 people on there and then not give any evidence for what you're doing, especially when you've been so incompetent like the way the Trump administration has, isn't good enough. Isn't absolutely good enough. The other thing I wanted to talk about was JD Vance and the whole JD Vance and Epstein thing. Not just JD Vance, but all these people around Donald Trump. So I think it was yesterday. Remember the birthday card that apparently Trump, pretty sure Trump gave to Epstein on Epstein's 50th birthday. Well, he sued the Wall Street Journal for making a suggestion. So we never actually saw the card. And now recently they brought out the birthday card. It's actually got his signature at the bottom. And when you look at his signature matched to a whole bunch of other signatures where he's definitely done them, they're identical, right? They're identical. But the amount of gaslighting from people like Mike Johnson and a whole bunch of other people in the Republican Party, not just the Republican Party, but also MAGA media, right? Like Fox News, but online influencers, have all been telling us that there's no way that that's Trump's signature, even though we have access to a whole bunch, because he's a public figure. We have a whole bunch of him signing things for, for auctions, for charities, all that sort of stuff. So we have all this, like we have hundreds of his examples, and they look identical. So and they're just gaslighting us, right? And again, it's just the way they treat the American people is with so much disrespect. I've always said this. I wrote an article about this on the Joe Thomas newsletter, and I say this all the time on my Substack Live where I stream. And I'll say it again. Nobody disrespects the MAGA base more than Trump and MAGA media, Fox News and all that. They treat them like they're complete morons. And they might not be wrong there, right? They might be right. Because how can you, the amount of lies that they say to their people, obvious lies. We're not talking about lies that it's hard to confirm whether they're truth or not, just obvious lies. Like this, like their signature is not nothing like this. Trump's signature is nothing like the one on the birthday card. That is such a lie. And then Mike Johnson comes out, this is my favorite, comes out the other day, and he says, well, I think this whole thing's a hoax, blah, blah, blah. And then he talks about the fact that Donald Trump could have been, right? He could have been, he was an FBI informant, and he was basically to expose Epstein. Now, this is a first. No one's ever said this before. A couple of days later, after everyone was making fun of him, he rolled it back, right? He said, oh, no, that's not, I might have misspoken. I didn't really mean to say that. And it's just so crazy the way they lie. Now, Trump has turned his administration into him, where they just constantly lie like he does. When Gavin Newsom does all those posts online on Twitter, and he's basically mocking Trump. So he sounds like Trump, but he's actually mocking Trump on Twitter. And a lot of Fox News people and MAGA media and Republicans will say things like, oh, he's mimicking Trump, because he wants to be Trump. Like, most of them know that he's not mimicking, but they know the base probably fall for that. Everyone knows he's not mimicking Trump. He's mocking Trump, right? There's a big difference. He's mocking Trump. And the only people who are mimicking Trump, trying to be like Trump, are the Trump administration or MAGA media, who just copy what he does. Trump lies all the time. Now Mike Johnson lies all the time, right? Trump says something, they just regurgitate it completely the same. This is like the most sycophantic group I've ever seen in my life, where when they have like an Oval Office meeting, and they just one at a time, they just tell him, they just glaze him and tell him what a beautiful man he is, and they've never seen such a beautiful man before. He would make, I'm sure the North Korean leaders looking at Trump and jealous about the way the people around him. Yeah. So again, it's a lot of this constant lying about the Epstein files, and everybody knows it's a lie, but they just double down all the time, right? And when you see the polling, from, like I saw polling the other day, it's consistent all the time. And I'm talking about polling amongst Republicans. It doesn't matter what Trump says or Trump does, it always sits around 91%. That is extraordinary, considering everything like the Epstein files, considering that the whole Epstein thing for the last 4 or 5 years has been more of a MAGA thing, right? They were the ones obsessed with everything Epstein, right? Everything Epstein, like Kash Patel was going on podcasts for the last 4 years with Joe Rogan and all these other, manosphere guys similar to Joe Rogan. And the Joe Rogan fans, they love anything like Epstein or conspiracy. They love that sort of stuff, right? So Kash Patel was going on there. Pam Bondi was doing the same thing, going everywhere, talking about it. And Dan Bongino was also doing the same thing, going on podcasts. Yeah, in fact, he had his own podcast where he was talking about Epstein all the time. Then they get into power, and they like, oh, actually, it's a hoax. There's nothing to see here, right? So they started the whole build-up. They campaigned on releasing the Epstein files. And then, obviously, Donald Trump. I will have to say that I would say Donald Trump, even though he went along with the whole Epstein thing, he was always nervous talking about it. He wasn't he wasn't as confident talking about opening the Epstein files as the people around him. But he used it as a way to get people like Joe Rogan to support him. So he lied to all these people, right? He lied to Joe Rogan and all these people all these people like Cash Patel, they went on these podcasts and they told them like, you can't trust the liberals with the Epstein files because they're all in there. That's what they were saying. And so people like Joe Rogan fell for it. And so they in part voted for them because they thought, because in a way the Epstein files is all about the deep state. That's the way they look at it. They look at it as the deep state. That's what Joe Rogan, all these, Alex Jones, they all look at it for the deep state. So and the Epstein files is the thing about is basically encapsulates the deep state. So when that didn't happen, a lot of people like Joe Rogan turned against him. Right? That doesn't necessarily mean that Joe Rogan is going to become a Democrat. It will depend on who runs as a Democrat. If it's like a centrist, he probably won't go over them. It would have to be someone who's into conspiracies and anti-vax like that. It's got to be someone like that, I think, for Joe Rogan, because he's completely gone now with the vaccines. Like the other day, he was even talking about polio vaccines not being very good. Like not even the mRNA. It started with the mRNA vaccines, but now he's like, he's gone full RFK Junior, right? So he's to some degree too far gone in that sense. But if there were Democrats who could go on this show, I definitely would recommend to go on his show. And they don't have to talk about that stuff. They could talk about other stuff. But yeah. So basically, that's the Epstein thing there. JD Vance is trying to make it out like he posted something the other day where he said, the liberals don't care about the victims of the Epstein files, because if they did, they would have released something in the last 4 years. Now, you can make an argument that some liberals and left wing people like myself are more interested in the Epstein files now than we were a couple of years ago. But it's also the fact that liberals and Democrats were not campaigning on that. They weren't saying there wasn't a whole bunch of Democrats from the FBI, the deputy FBI, like Pam Bondi, Attorney General, going on all these shows and say, "Hey, we're going to release it." Bam, bam, bam. They didn't. And the other thing that we didn't do on the left is we didn't politicize it. I would have thought that Bill Clinton probably has as much chance to be on there as Donald Trump, and I don't see many people defending Bill Clinton the way MAGA defend Donald Trump. They constantly go, "Oh, Bill Clinton." Well, I think most Democrats will go, "Okay, well, if Bill Clinton's in there, get him as well." We're not out there defending him. But with Trump, they're like, no. Even though this guy had this really close relationship with, Donald Trump for years and years, right? They pick Donald Trump as their savior to release the files. That's a pretty strange thing, I think. You could have picked just about anyone else to be the savior to release the Epstein files besides the actual guy who had a close relationship with Trump. So again, JD Vance saying that is complete. There's a tiny bit of truth in that, but most of it is a lie. And the fact of the matter is Donald Trump, on the same day that the Epstein victims were giving testimony and also going on TV and talking about what happened to them, Trump in the background was just calling it a hoax. So the Democrats never called it a hoax. The Democrats, in a sense, went, well, this is a court thing, and let's leave it up to the courts to decide. The MAGA movement said, no, we don't want just the courts to decide. We want to make decisions on this, until they found out Donald Trump was all over it, and then suddenly they're not interested anymore. It's like, there's nothing to see here, right? So they're two completely different things. If you campaign on something, if you talk about it all the time, if you convince a whole bunch of people like Joe Rogan to back you because of it, and then you don't do it, that's a very big difference to someone like the Democrats who said, well, let the courts decide. So that's kind of where I stand on that there. RFK Jr. Is just getting worse. I want to talk about RFK Jr. a little bit more. He's just getting worse and worse. The other day talking about the polio vaccines, and we've got in Florida now they're getting rid of the mandatory, and we're not just talking about COVID vaccines. We're talking about polio, measles, all this. So no longer compulsory in schools. A lot of these vaccines, you need to have herd immunity. You need to have above 92, 93%, right? So this could have a massive impact in terms of measles, because I think there's no doubt about it. Having someone like Trump and RFK Jr. Now, again, RFK Jr. is the Secretary of Health of the United States. I mean, there's a lot of people who think he's crazy. There's no doubt about that, right? There's a lot of people who think he's crazy, but he's also going to have influence amongst people. He's giving, in a sense, people like Joe Rogan and people who listen to Joe Rogan, we're talking about a lot of people here. He's given them credibility because he's the Secretary of Health, and to a lot of people now. Uh, so a lot of people who were maybe didn't think about it, like they might not be pro-vaccine, they might not be anti-vaccine, but they might be pro-Trump, and now they think, well, the Secretary of Health is telling us this, so I'm just going to go along with that, because not everyone is in one camp or the other. There's a lot of people, especially like maybe low socio people, less education, who get the vaccines because they want to take their kids to school and it's part of the system. They don't hate that. They're not against it, but they wouldn't risk, they probably don't think about it one way or the other. So if they don't have to do it, they might just not do it. And some people might not just do it because they think, I can't be, if it's not mandatory, I'm not going to do it. So, but just so you know, in Australia, it would be the same thing. Like if you didn't make it mandatory in schools to have like polio and stuff like that, a lot of the parents probably would just say no because they don't know anything about it, and they might not even have a strong stance one way or the other. And that's a real problem, I think, in that sense of, bringing down herd immunity, but changing the culture, changing the way, you look at medicine. Because when he says you can't trust the science or you can't trust the CDC and you can't trust that, what he's doing is he's conflating a lot of the best thing that ever happened to RFK Junior and a lot of people like him was COVID, because they always use COVID as a reason to why they are right and everyone else is wrong. So they'll take a once in 100-year pandemic where everybody's going to make mistakes. Nobody in any pandemic would ever get 100% things right. But what they do is they isolate those mistakes. They repeat them over and over again. Like, for example, the COVID vaccines, the COVID vaccines don't have 100% protection. They don't stop transmission, right? So when initially the COVID vaccines were tested, initially they weren't tested for whether you could pass it on to someone else. They were tested for, do they stop severe illness and hospitalization and death? That's what they were tested for. They weren't tested to stop transmission, right? So a lot of people think they were. And secondly, you got to remember that so what they did is they did a trial with the COVID mRNA vaccines, and the trials that they did, they found that because these trials were done, so they had a couple of months with people who had the vaccine in the community, 3 or 4 months, because they had to bring the vaccines out quickly, and very few of those people actually ended up with COVID. Right. So, but again, it wasn't tested for that. So they came out and said, look, your chances of getting COVID with this are low. It was never meant to be that. It was never meant to say that if you get the vaccine, you won't get it. They never said that. They just said, based on this initial study. It's also very important to remember that the COVID vaccines did actually reduce, not stop, but reduce transmission with the initial one, which is the alpha strain, and it did reduce it by quite a lot. The problem is that we then got another strain and then a different strain, and with each strain, it reduced it less, right? And on top of that, what they also found out is that after about 6 months, the effectiveness of that, in terms of stopping it, reduced. So those two things. So the virus morphing into something else and into a different strain, and the vaccine, although the vaccine protection in terms of getting COVID reduced over 6 months, the part where it stopped hospitalization or death stayed very strong, very strong. So that's the important part. So you'll never hear RFK Jr. ever talk about the effectiveness of hospitalization or deaths. They always want to stick to the bit about it didn't stop transmission. And that's because that's the only part that they've got, even though they were never tested for that. But as soon as you talk about, did it reduce hospitalization by 80% against people who didn't? Yeah, he doesn't want to talk about it, right? Did it stop people from dying? That he doesn't want to talk about it. So again, he also said during that that meeting the other day when he was being sort of grilled by a whole bunch of people, mostly Democrats, he said, did you know that COVID vaccines cause myocarditis? Just so you know, the best the Democrats didn't give this answer, but this is the best answer to that, right? The myocarditis connection between mRNA vaccines and that was known very early on and was published very early on. I got the COVID vaccine in Australia. I got the Pfizer, the mRNA, right? And about 2 months after they were released, so very early days, I went to a hub to get my vaccine, and the nurse handed me a piece of paper, which she handed to everyone on the way in. And at the top, you had 4 or 5 very common side effects of the vaccine: headaches, sore arm, tiredness for a couple of days, that sort of thing. And then on the bottom of it, it had less common but more severe, and one of them was myocarditis. Right? So the idea that they were trying to hide it is complete BS. Now, the chances of getting myocarditis is insanely low. Insanely low, right? So of course you're not gonna talk about something over and over again to the degree that RFK Junior does want to talk about it, if it isn't a bigger problem. They made the problem out to be bigger than it was. So it was a side effect. Nobody denied it was a side effect, but RFK Jr. is trying to pretend like people were trying to cover it up, but they weren't. Anybody knew that it was a side effect of it, but it was a very, very, very rare side effect. So no one's, and at the end of the day, if you had to choose between, you've never had COVID before, because remember, we're talking about 2020, 2021, you've never had COVID before, and you have 2 people who've never had COVID, so they've got no natural immunity, nothing. And we're talking about the more deadly strains, which is the Alpha, right, and the Delta. They were the most, the one that we have at the moment. Omicron is less deadly. So back then, we're dealing with people who have had no natural immunity with a stronger strain that was more deadly. And if you gave someone a vaccine before they got COVID, say like a month or so before, and then someone else didn't get, the chances of that person being hospitalized who didn't get it was like a lot more. So, and the same with death. So again, it's just trying to lie. His RFK Jr. and Joe Rogan are trying to take America back to a time before basically the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages. Because if you take away studies and peer-reviewed studies and that sort of thing, where you look at data, then basically you're basically back to, my neighbor Bob, he's got a really good treatment for cancer. You just put a little bit of ivermectin, just rub a little bit of ivermectin on your cancerous lump, and that will go away. Like, that's basically what we're going to end up with. Your neighbor's advice, or your uncle's advice, or some random person on Facebook's advice is just as good as your doctor's advice, or just as good as a study with a peer-reviewed study where hundreds of doctors all looked through the data and said, this is right, this is wrong. We're going back to the days of this, it's anecdotal evidence. So again, it's just really crazy, the whole thing. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I think I might stop it there. So as you know, my name is Joe Thomas from the Joe Thomas Newsletter on Substack. So come on to my Substack account, the Joe Thomas Newsletter, and subscribe. You can subscribe to me. I do Substack live videos that you can watch. I write articles all about American politics, media, and culture. Thank you so much for everybody. I just want to say one more thing before I go, is that the other day, just one moment. The other day I did a video on Substack Live with 2 people, and they were with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And basically what they are is they want to change, they want to bring in the National Popular Vote instead of having the Electoral College like we've got at the moment. And they're actually they're doing pretty good. So each state, they have to get each state to agree to this, right, to do it. And then and I think they have about 17 states. So once they get to 270 electoral college, they can actually bring it in where instead of the president being elected in America because of the way it is at the moment, just because of a couple of battleground states, Pennsylvania, whatever, it will go down to whoever won the popular vote. And the woman I spoke to was Alyssa Cass and Pat Rosenstein, and they're with the National Popular Vote.com. So you can go on their website if you want to support them. And you can talk to your local person if you're like in a state and get them to sign up to this particular pact, or you can have a look at it. But the reason I want to talk about it today is because, unfortunately, during the video, there was an echo when they were talking, specifically when Alyssa was talking, and the echo was so bad, the audio was so bad, it was fine when I was talking, that I actually had to unpublish it. So I'm trying to get the video fixed at the moment, but a couple of people said the echoing was too loud. It wasn't probably, but I couldn't leave it up on my Substack because it was just the quality of the audio was just so bad. So I'm still looking at trying to get someone to fix it. But I feel really bad because I was really looking forward to having them on, and they reached out to me and asked to come on my show. And I thought it was a really good idea what they've done. And yeah, I was shocked I haven't heard of it because they're actually quite popular, what they're doing. So the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So yeah, go online and have a look about it. And hopefully I can get the video up again. Or maybe I can catch up with them in, again, another 3-6 months and get a bit of an update on how it's going. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.